Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to today's episode of Watch Chronicler Unscripted. This is available as both a video on YouTube and as a podcast on any platform you might be able to find, whether that's SoundCloud, Spotify or iTunes, but also elsewhere. You should be able to find us as Watch Chronicler Unscripted. Now in today's episode of the podcast, and of course the video if you're watching us on YouTube with pictures, we're talking about the biggest news we've had this year from a major brand in terms of a release, the Tudor Black Bay 58 Navy Blue. Now the Black Bay has always been the centre of Tudor's modern line. It's a watch which represents Tudor trying to honour their heritage, and I think in the early days of the Black Bay, in the early 2010s, they offered a watch which was a sort of vintage alternative to a Rolex Submariner. Now I feel it's more than that because it's a much more charismatic, much warmer take on the Submariner, and also for a more reasonable budget. The Black Bay was always a really nice watch, whether you look at the very early versions with the smile dial, if you will, with the curved text with the ETA movement, which are still probably the most authentic Black Bays, with that heritage of having the ETA movement rather than in-house movement, whether Rolex or anything else. But since the mid-2010s, we've seen the in-house Black Bays, and later the hugely popular Black Bay 58, which at 39mm was the watch we were all looking forward to when the Black Bay first came out. Now, it was available in only one variant until today. Today, they've released a new version, the Navy Blue. And this is probably the most leaked watch the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation has ever released. It's a hugely leaked watch. To be honest, we've all known that a blue version of the Black Bay 58 was going to come out, and we all knew it was going to be today. But today I'd like to speak about what this new release is, why it's Tudor's first true Submariner alternative, in my opinion at least, and whether it should matter. Because we're going through a period of crisis worldwide. For most countries, the coronavirus situation has started to withdraw and is on the way out. But the economic situation is still very much at play when it comes to brands like this. Of course, we're not going to see Tudor go anywhere, but there are plenty of brands we are going to see disappear, and that's why this is an interesting release to bring the eye back and the attention back to new releases this year, which were lost anyway because of the loss of Baselworld. So there's all that to look forward to in today's episode, but also a historical overview of why a blue Black Bay at 39mm should matter. So what is the new Tudor Black Bay 58 in Navy Blue? Well, it's the first new colour variation of the very popular Black Bay 58, and importantly it doesn't just have a blue bezel as was the case on previous Black Bays, but actually has a blue dial as well to match that. Otherwise, it is unchanged from the Black Bay 58 with its slim 39mm case, which cuts down its thickness, which was always a problem with the original 41mm Black Bay. Otherwise, the case is, as I've said, unchanged, with the exposed crown which sticks out somewhat and gives you that lovely 1950s sort of feel, with the beveled edges to the lugs, and also the coin-edge bezel, which is more delicate, certainly no more fragile, but more delicate, it has to be said, than, for example, a Rolex Submariner bezel. It also still features an aluminium bezel insert rather than a ceramic or sapphire bezel insert because it gives that matte appearance which fits with the vintage connotations of this watch. But what I think is most important about this watch is that it's a new offering to Tudor buyers for someone who wants an affordable but more playful version of a Rolex Submariner, but not the vintage connotations. Because, of course, this watch still has the same dial arrangement, which I think is the most popular arrangement, with the elongated triangle at 12, something which, incidentally, I wish Rolex still produced, and then the circular and rectangular indices around the rest of the dial with no date. But importantly, it doesn't have any sort of vintage touches. What I mean by this is that it no longer has cream or tan aged luminova on the hands, or indeed the bezel insert with a red pip at 12, and it loses the gold accents as well in favour of silver. This means you now have these silver, presumably rhodium plated markers around the dial, as well as silver coloured hands, which I think gives a much cleaner, much crisper look, and something which is more appropriate for every occasion without that vintage touch. Now this isn't a limited edition at all, it is just a new addition to the Black Bay 58 line, and these watches are now in stores. So these actually were shipped out before the release, so you can buy these straight away if you go to a shop today and buy one, which is fairly new as a concept, and certainly for the Hans Wilsdorf Foundation it's unheard of for Rolex, but for Tudor it's a new measure. Reminds me a bit in fact of old Apple products where they would have them shipped to the shops in sealed containers, before they were released so they could be sold almost immediately. Inside these watches there is the same movement as before, the smaller MT5402 movement, which has a 70-hour power reserve, silicon hairspring, and is of course a cost chronometer movement. So it's a really fantastic option as far as in-house movements go. These are movements which are designed to be tough. They're not necessarily designed to be pretty, these aren't decorated, but they are really very, very cleverly conceived to be resilient, robust and reliable, and that's exactly what you want in a timepiece like this, with a closed case back. Where pricing is concerned, these watches match the Black Bay 58 in black perfectly. So on either a leather strap or indeed the rather lovely Tudor woven strap, these are £2,520, and if you want the riveted steel bracelet, you have to go up to £2,760, although I urge anyone to buy it on the bracelet if they possibly can, because the resale value will be held much better if you do change your mind, and also if you sell the bracelet you'll be able to get hold of either of those straps perfectly easily, without the hassle of having to pay an enormous amount to buy the bracelet. I do think it's a little bit cheap of Tudor not to include the woven strap with the bracelet model, which they're used to, but nonetheless, they're all lovely straps or bracelets, and I'm sure they will suit each owner very well, but again I would urge you to buy it on the bracelet in the first place. Now, something to consider before I talk about the history of this blue coloration in the history of the Tudor Submariner, and indeed the Tudor Black Bay nowadays, which I think is important to note if you want to understand why blue is so important and so emotive as a colour for Tudor. It's worth considering why this watch has been released. Of course, Baselworld was cancelled this year, and Tudor and Rolex have been fairly quiet in terms of their releases this time round. I think most people expected there to be a new colourway for the Black Bay, and these have been difficult times recently in terms of sales and in terms of keeping the reputation of these brands, which I think is the most important aspect. The price, or rather the resale price, of Tudors and Rolexes was beginning to drop. And since the weekend, and I'm not going to comment actually on why this happened because I think my speculation is as good as anyone else's, Rolex saw an enormous peak in terms of their sales at Philips in their most recent auction, with frankly astonishing, to be honest, ridiculous prices, or hammer prices, for current production models. So there is the assumption that there was more afoot in terms of maintaining Rolex's values. So that's something to bear in mind on the Rolex side, but for Tudor, a new release was the obvious thing to do. And it's certainly no doubt that releasing a new Black Bay in blue like this, especially a 58, would be the ideal way of putting them back on the map and in people's minds in this time when a lot of other brands have simply paused their new releases. But now for a spot of history, because blue is a very evocative colour where Tudor watches are concerned, and I think it's important to note this because it's going to be a major contributing factor to the popularity of the new Black Bay in blue in the 58 configuration in 39mm size. Now, the inspiration for the Black Bay came in 1958 with the reference 7924. Now, this was actually the third generation of Tudor Submariner. Before this, there was the original 1954 7922, which was only water resistant to 100 metres and had a small crown, and they did briefly go to manual wind in 1955. But the 1958 model really is the definitive large crown Tudor Submariner. It had a 37mm case, a 200-metre water resistance with a large crown, and had, of course, the Mercedes hands of Rolex. But the military connotations and military history which made the blue dial on Tudors so popular really began in 1959 with the reference 7928. This was the first Tudor Submariner to have a more modern case with crown guards. It also had a more aggressive bezel design too, to be gripped more easily, and this piece kept the same 200-metre water resistance, but grew to 39mm, the size of the modern Black Bay 58. This also had 3 generations of crown guards, with square crown guards to begin with, which were difficult to operate because of the crown being difficult to reach. Later pointed crown guards because they shaved down those original crown guards to make them easier to use. These in fact have been carried over to the modern day Tudor Pelagos, and then the Submariner crown guards, which we've seen on all pre-ceramic Submariners with crown guards from Rolex. What's most important here though was that these watches were in fact used by the US Navy. These watches weren't blue, by the way, they were black, but this began that military use of the Tudor Submariner as a very tough, robust watch, but a more affordable option than a Rolex Submariner. Now, you could argue that the most important year for the Tudor Submariner was 1969, with the release of the reference 7016 and the date version, the 7021. These kept all the features which people loved from the earlier Submariners, including the Crown Guard's the 39mm case, the 200-metre water resistance. But now these watches gain something more, a new dial and handset. Whilst early models did have rounded markers available on their dials, they very quickly became watches with snowflake dials and snowflake hands, giving you this quintessential Tudor look. These were also the first Tudor Submariners to feature a blue dial and blue bezel. This is important because Rolex didn't offer such dials and bezels at the time. The white gold blue Submariner didn't exist at this stage, and so they were offering something truly new. Importantly, these watches were the first to be used by the French Navy, the Marine Nationale, with black dial models being used pretty much exclusively in these early years and being offered on no bracelet at all, so encouraging them to produce their own straps, hence the now very famous Marine Nationale style strap produced from the parachute cords which they had from their equipment, which they'd used to fashion straps. In 1975, there was the first quintessential military Navy Submariner with a blue dial. This was the reference 9401/1, which was the first hacking Tudor Submariner and was very similar, in fact, to the previous versions with Crown Guards, except now it had a blue dial in military form. And what I mean by this was that they found that blue dials, or at least the story says, is that they found that blue dials were more resilient to the sun and to sun damage as well as humidity than the previous black dials, and so the Marine Nationale started using these blue dials instead, thus creating the icon which we now see in navy blue form on the new Black Bay 58. Of course, for almost every year that we've seen over the past decade, there's been some form of new Black Bay, whether it's been a two-tone model, a model with a smooth bezel, a new size, everything from 32mm all the way up to the 41mm models we've seen, with new dive watch variants, with varying popularity. Even the P01, that rather peculiar and I think quite exciting piece, produced a few years ago. But I'll be curious to hear what you have to say about this new Navy model, and what you want to see from Tudor later this year, because I'm sure this won't be the only release this year from Tudor, and I think it would be nice to see some other varieties from the brand, other collections in fact, updated with new models. So tell me what you fancy from amongst these. Also, do remember to like, share and subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube, or follow us on whichever podcast platform you like, because it really helps and allows us to continue producing this content for you. So thank you very much for listening. This is Armand from WatchChronicler.com, out.